The ground beneath your feet can become your greatest enemy. This is the hidden story of our world, where natural catastrophes have not merely ended civilizations, but actively built them. We are about to explore how earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions forced humanity to rewrite its own rules, compelling entire societies to completely reinvent their architecture and beliefs. By the end, you will see history in a new way, not as a simple timeline, but as a thrilling story of human resilience shaped by the planet's raw power. How did a single volcanic explosion shatter one empire and forge another? Why would a thriving city choose to build its homes inside a sheer cliff face? The answers are written in stone and myth. What do you think is the most important lesson a civilization can learn from a disaster? History often remembers the collapse, but it forgets the rebirth. To truly grasp how civilizations rebuilt, we must first shift our perspective on disaster. It is not merely an ending, but a powerful beginning. The most transformative moments in human history are not periods of quiet comfort, but moments of profound rupture when the very ground of reality shifts. A catastrophe does not just destroy buildings, it demolishes an entire worldview. When the trusted mountain smokes and trembles, when the reliable river rises to swallow homes, the old assurances crumble. What was once considered permanent and safe is suddenly revealed as fragile. This creates a powerful, if terrifying, vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into that space of fear and uncertainty rush new questions, new needs, and ultimately, new answers. This is the hidden engine of progress. The architecture that follows is not just about stronger mortar or taller walls. It is a physical prayer, a statement carved in stone that says, "We understand you now, and we will not be caught unprepared again." Similarly, belief systems evolve. If the old rituals fail to protect the community from the flood or the quake, then new understandings of the divine must be sought. Perhaps the gods are not benevolent guardians, but powerful forces that must be constantly appeased with greater tribute and more elaborate temples. Or perhaps the disaster itself is a message, a demand for humanity to live in closer harmony with the world's rhythms. This dialogue between human society and a volatile planet is written in every surviving monument and every enduring myth. So before we look at the specific cities and cultures, hold this idea. The greatest human innovations in how we build and what we believe were often forged in the fires of necessity, a direct and creative response to the planet's most violent whispers. This reframes our entire journey from one of passive victims to active participants in a continuous, shaping conversation with the Earth itself. The vibrant heart of this ancient world pulsed at the palace of Knossos on Crete. Here, the Minoan civilization thrived, a sophisticated network of trade and artistry centered around sprawling, open-air complexes with intricate courtyards and vivid frescoes. Their power and identity were woven into the sea, a confident mastery of the Mediterranean that fed their economy and likely shaped their beliefs. Then, in an instant, the very source of their strength turned against them. Around the year 1600 before Common Era, the island of Thera, a mere 70 miles north, vanished in a cataclysm. The volcanic explosion was so immense it is considered one of the largest in human history. The event would trigger a chain of disasters that forced the first great reinvention in our story. First, the sea they commanded became a wall of water. The collapse of the volcano's core into the sea generated tsunamis of staggering height, which raced south to smash the northern coast of Crete. Harbors and fleet, the lifelines of Minoan commerce, were simply erased. Then came the sky, falling as a blanket of fine volcanic ash. It choked farmlands, blotted out the sun for a prolonged period, and crippled agriculture across the region. This was not just physical damage, it was a spiritual and economic decapitation. The maritime economy that sustained the lavish palace system was shattered. Confidence in the deities associated with the benevolent sea and the prosperous earth would have evaporated amidst such incomprehensible violence. Why did the gods of the waves send destruction? Why did the earth itself spew darkness? The centralized labyrinthine palace architecture, with its focus on ceremonial spaces and storage, suddenly seemed perilously vulnerable. In the aftermath, the old political order centered on Knossos fragmented. We see a powerful reinvention begin. New settlements sprang up across Crete, but they were different. They were often located further inland, on easily defensible hilltops, surrounded by robust fortification walls. The open, artistic confidence of the Minoan palaces gave way to a more pragmatic, fortified design. This architectural shift signals a profound change in priority, from celebrating prosperity to ensuring survival. Meanwhile, on the mainland of Greece, the Mycenaean culture was rising. They witnessed the Minoan collapse and absorbed its lessons and its legacy. They adopted Minoan artistic motifs and writing, but fused them with a radically different vision. Their architecture became the massive, fortified citadel, like the famous Lion Gate at Mycenae, built with colossal stones for defense and statement of power. The old Minoan world of bull-leaping ceremonies and nature goddesses gradually transformed, giving way to the more martial pantheon of gods we recognize from later Greek mythology. The Thera eruption did not just end a civilization, it acted as a catalyst, shattering one worldview and providing the raw materials, both literal and cultural, for another to be built in its place. Their story of fire and sea finds a powerful echo in one of water and earth, half a world away. While the Minoans faced a sudden volcanic shock, another great civilization grappled with a slower, more insidious kind of catastrophe. The cities of the Indus Valley, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, represent one of history's most astonishing feats of early urban planning. Walking their streets over 4,000 years ago, you would have seen a vision of remarkable order. Wide, straight avenues laid out in a precise grid, houses equipped with indoor bathing areas, and an underground network of drains and sewers that rivals many modern towns. At the heart of it all stood the Great Bath, a large, waterproofed public pool that suggests ritual purification was central to their society. This entire sophisticated world was a gift of the river. The mighty Indus and its life-giving tributaries like the Ganga-Hakra were the arteries of their civilization, providing water for drinking, for agriculture, and for the clay that built their uniform, baked brick homes. Their stability was an architectural expression of trust in the river's bounty. But what happens when the river you have built your entire identity upon simply decides to leave? Research suggests this is precisely the slow-motion disaster that unfolded. A combination of factors, including shifts in the Earth's crust from distant tectonic activity and broader changes in monsoon patterns, began to strangle the vital Ganga-Hakra river system. Over generations, this once reliable water source may have gradually dried up or changed its course dramatically, abandoning the cities and farmlands that depended on it. Imagine the creeping dread as harvests failed year after year, as wells ran dry, and the familiar riverbanks became parched, cracked earth. This was not a single explosive event, but a prolonged environmental unraveling. The catastrophe here was one of absence, of vanishing. The agricultural collapse would have been total, making it impossible to sustain the dense populations of their great cities. The orderly grid of streets, the sophisticated drainage, the Great Bath itself, all became monuments to a relationship with the environment that no longer existed. In response, the people of the Indus Valley did not vanish, they transformed. Faced with the failure of their urban model, they likely undertook a great deurbanization. Large, centralized populations dispersed into smaller, more mobile groups who could follow shifting water sources. Their architecture, once a symbol of permanent, baked brick order, had to adapt. They turned to more readily available, perishable materials like wood, reeds, and mud, building settlements that could be more easily abandoned or moved. This shift from stone and brick to wood and thatch is not a step backward, but a brilliant, pragmatic reinvention for survival. Their beliefs would have evolved alongside their homes. The central, purifying role of water, so evident in the Great Bath, likely took on a new, more urgent meaning. When a river disappears, water transforms from a given fact of life into a precious, divine mystery. Scholars see in this experience a possible seed for spiritual ideas that would later flourish in the Vedic traditions, which speak profoundly of cosmic cycles of creation, preservation, and dissolution. The river that gave life could also take it away, teaching a lesson in impermanence that would be etched into the region's spiritual consciousness for millennia. Their reinvention was not about building higher walls, but about learning to flow like the water they revered, finding resilience in flexibility rather than permanence. The jungle canopy once echoed with a different kind of thunder, not from storms but from the voices of thousands gathered below pyramids of gleaming white limestone, watching their divine king commune with the ancestors to bring the life-giving rains. For centuries, the classic Maya civilization of places like Tikal and Calakmul was a testament to human triumph in a challenging environment. Their architecture was a dialogue with the heavens, each step of their towering temples a symbolic ascent closer to the gods who controlled the sun, the stars, and most crucially, the water. Then the dialogue broke down. Beginning around the year 800 of the Common Era, the rains began to falter. This was not a single bad season, but a relentless series of mega-droughts, periods of severe aridity that could last for decades. The slow-motion nature of this catastrophe made it all the more insidious. As years turned into dry decades, the reservoirs carved into the limestone bedrock dwindled. Crops failed again and again. The social contract that held Maya society together began to fracture. The king's divine mandate was a simple bargain. He performed the rituals to ensure cosmic order and agricultural abundance, and in return, the people built his monuments and fueled his wars. When the rains did not come, despite ever more elaborate ceremonies, the faith in that bargain evaporated. The resulting hardship strained the intricate network of trade and alliance between city-states, tipping them into conflict over dwindling resources. The architectural response to this crisis was not to build grander temples, but to walk away from them. In a profound geographical reinvention, the great population centers of the southern lowlands were largely abandoned. People did not vanish, they moved. They migrated towards more reliable water sources, to coastal areas, to lake shores, and to northern regions with better access to groundwater. In these new homes, their architecture adapted. The single, massive ceremonial acropolis gave way to more dispersed and pragmatic building styles suited to these different landscapes. The focus shifted from impressing the gods in a central place to securing water in a sustainable way. This physical migration was mirrored by a spiritual one. The cult of the divine king, the Yuhul Ajor, whose identity was so tied to the failing central cities, went into steep decline. If the king could not bring the rain, what was his power? This created a vacuum in religious life that allowed for a significant transformation. In the post-classic period that followed, we see a shift towards more personal forms of worship, a greater emphasis on lineage ancestors, and the rise of new cultural syntheses, like the influence of Central Mexican styles seen at Chichen Itza. The Maya lesson is one of adaptation to a changing climate. Their reinvention was a survival strategy that traded monumental permanence for resilient mobility, and in doing so, allowed their culture to transform and endure in new forms, rather than collapse under the weight of its own stone promises. The silent stones of Machu Picchu hold a secret whispered by the trembling earth. In the high Andes, where tectonic plates grind with relentless force, the Inca people did not merely build structures to withstand earthquakes, they learned to build with them. This represents a profound leap in architectural philosophy. moving from a posture of resistance to one of intelligent collaboration. After experiencing the devastating power of seismic events that could shatter lesser walls, Inca stonemasons perfected a technique known as ashlar masonry. They would painstakingly carve massive blocks of granite, not into uniform bricks but into unique, multi-sided shapes. Each stone was an intricate puzzle piece, shaped to fit perfectly against its neighbors. The result was a wall assembled without any mortar at all. To the eye, it appears impossibly tight, with not even a blade of grass able to slip between the joints. But this precision was not for aesthetics alone. It was a brilliant engineering solution born of catastrophe. During an earthquake, a rigid, mortared wall tries to stand firm against the shaking and often cracks or collapses under the strain. An Inca wall, however, was designed to dance. The interlocking stones would sway and shuffle minutely with the tremors, absorbing and dissipating the energy, then settle gracefully back into their original, locked position once the shaking stopped. This was architecture that embraced flexibility and dynamic equilibrium, a direct dialogue with the unstable ground. Contrast this with the earlier, more vulnerable constructions of the region, like those of the Moche, whose adobe pyramids, while monumental, were far more susceptible to seismic damage. The Inca principle of building with, not against, the Earth's movement is a universal lesson written in stone. We see a parallel reinvention across the Pacific in traditional Japanese architecture. Living on another seismically active ring, Japanese carpenters for centuries employed sophisticated wooden joinery. Instead of using rigid nails, they crafted complex interlocking wooden joints that allowed buildings to sway like trees in a storm. The pagoda, with its central pillar acting as a massive shock absorber, is a testament to this same philosophy. In both Peru and Japan, repeated trauma forced a fundamental shift. The goal was no longer to create a static, imposing monument that defied nature, but to design a resilient, living system that could move in harmony with it. The catastrophe taught that true strength lies not in unbending rigidity, but in intelligent, graceful adaptation. A profound spiritual silence follows the physical roar. When the earth stops shaking and the floodwaters recede, a deeper crisis often remains, a rupture in the very covenant between a people and their gods. What do you do when the deities you have trusted, praised, and sacrificed to for generations seem to turn their backs, or worse, actively unleash their fury upon you? This moment of theological disillusionment is one of the most powerful catalysts for reinvention, forcing civilizations to rebuild not just their homes, but their entire understanding of the cosmos. The response is rarely to abandon belief altogether, but to urgently seek new explanations, to find or create gods who make sense of the new, terrifying reality. This spiritual overhaul can take two distinct paths, shaped by the nature of the catastrophe itself. For societies facing a constant, looming threat, belief becomes an intricate science of cosmic maintenance. Consider ancient Egypt, a civilization utterly defined by the Nile. Their survival depended on the annual inundation, a predictable flood that deposited rich, life-giving silt across the fields. But the river was not always perfectly obedient. A flood that was too low meant famine. A flood that was too high meant devastation. This ever-present anxiety of irregularity forged one of history's most complex and stable religious systems. The Egyptians developed a vast pantheon where every natural force had a divine counterpart, and the entire system was governed by the concept of Maat, the fundamental order of the universe. At the heart of this was the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile flood. He was not a distant figure, but an intensely worshipped force of fertility. More importantly, the pharaoh was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of the god Horus, and his primary divine duty was to uphold Maat. This meant performing exact rituals and ceremonies to ensure the cosmic balance that guaranteed the Nile's benevolent flow. Their entire theology and the pharaoh's legitimacy were architectural projects designed to manage environmental fear, to build a metaphysical dam against chaos through unwavering ritual order. In stark contrast, societies struck by sudden, violent catastrophes often witness the dramatic rise of entirely different kinds of deities. When a volcano explodes without warning, burying the world in ash and fire, the old gods of the harvest and the sky can seem inadequate. What emerges from the smoke are gods of raw, capricious power, deities of destruction and renewal. Existing gods of the underworld, once perhaps minor figures in the pantheon, are suddenly elevated to new prominence. They reflect a hard-won, terrifying new truth that the world is not a stable garden, but a living entity capable of immense and sudden violence. The divine is no longer just a benevolent parent, but also a powerful and unpredictable force that must be approached with a mix of awe, fear, and immense respect. This theological shift is a direct mirror of the architectural one. It is the belief system learning to bend rather than break, to incorporate the reality of chaos into a new, more resilient understanding of the sacred. The gods themselves are reinvented, becoming as complex and sometimes as dangerous as the natural world they are asked to explain. Their stone dance with the earth finds a haunting parallel in a landscape of sun and silence. High on the Colorado Plateau, the ancestral Pueblones faced a catastrophe of absence, not of shaking ground, but of vanishing water. For generations, their world was one of mesa-top villages, with pit houses and later, above-ground pueblos clustered around central plazas and great kivas. These large, circular, semi-subterranean chambers were the heart of community life, places where ceremonies connected everyone to the cycles of the cosmos and the land. Their architecture reflected a society organized around shared ritual and open spaces, a life in balance with a challenging but predictable environment. Then, in the 13th century, that balance shattered. A profound drought lasting nearly a quarter of a century gripped the region. This was not a simple dry spell, but a generations-long crisis that parched the soil, emptied the springs, and withered the crops that sustained their growing populations. Life on the exposed mesa tops, dependent on rainfall for agriculture and distant water sources, became a relentless struggle. The social fabric, likely already strained by resource scarcity, faced immense pressure. Their response was one of the most dramatic architectural reinventions in human history. They did not just build new walls, they chose an entirely new relationship with the landscape itself. They began to construct their homes in the sheer cliff faces of canyon walls, in natural alcoves carved by millennia of erosion. Places like Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde are not random shelters, they are masterpieces of crisis-born design. Building in these alcoves offered profound advantages. The south-facing cliffs captured the low winter sun for warmth but were shaded from the intense summer heat, creating a more stable, temperate microclimate. The rock overhangs provided natural protection from snow and rain, helping to conserve precious moisture. Perhaps most critically, the cliff dwellings were inherently defensible, accessible only by precarious hand and tow trails or ladders that could be pulled up. This shift from open mesa-top villages to fortified cliff cities signals a fundamental change in priorities, from communal ceremony to communal security. This physical retreat into the cliffs was mirrored by a subtle but significant shift in spiritual and social life. The great kivas, those large communal structures that once anchored the mesa-top pueblos, became less common. In their place, we see a proliferation of smaller kivas, often integrated directly into the residential blocks of the cliff dwellings. This suggests a move away from large, pan-village ceremonies towards more family or clan-based rituals. When survival depends on the cooperation of a tight-knit group in a confined, defensive space, the social unit naturally becomes smaller and more focused. The spiritual focus may have turned inward, emphasizing the protection of the immediate household and the ancestors of the lineage, rather than appeals to broader cosmic forces for reign that no longer came. Their reinvention teaches us that adaptation can mean retreat, not as defeat, but as a strategic consolidation. By moving into the cliff walls, they were literally building their community into the fabric of the land that sustained them, finding resilience not by dominating their environment, but by seeking shelter within its most protective folds. Their story is a powerful testament to how environmental pressure can reshape not just where we live, but how we come together and what we hold sacred. The wind that once carried Norse ships to a green land now carried only a deepening cold. In the late 10th century, during what scholars call the medieval warm period, Viking explorers led by Eric the Red found the southwestern coast of Greenland surprisingly hospitable. They established the Eastern Settlement, a colony of several thousand souls who built a familiar world far from home. Their architecture was a direct transplant from Scandinavia, sturdy longhouses with thick turf walls and timber frames, and small stone churches like the one at Valsey. This was a European pastoral lifestyle, dependent on raising cattle, sheep, and goats, and growing hardy grains like barley in the brief summer. For centuries it worked. Then the climate itself began to shift. Starting in the 14th century, the Little Ice Age gradually tightened its grip on the North Atlantic. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened year by year, and the sea ice expanded, lingering longer and blocking crucial trade routes back to Iceland and Norway. The very environment that had welcomed them became increasingly hostile. Their architectural choices, once a symbol of cultural identity, became a growing liability. The longhouses, designed for a different climate, required immense amounts of fuel to heat during the ever longer winters. The colony had little native timber, relying on costly imports or driftwood for repairs and new construction. As trade became more difficult with encroaching sea ice, maintaining these European-style structures became a severe drain on dwindling energy and resources. Meanwhile, their belief system created a different kind of barrier. The Norse Greenlanders were devout Christians, answerable to a distant ecclesiastical hierarchy in Norway. Their identity was tied to being European Christians, a distinction that separated them from the indigenous Thule culture, the ancestors of the Inuit, who began to appear in the region around the same time the climate worsened. The Inuit were masters of the Arctic environment. Their technology was perfectly adapted to the cold, from sleek kayaks and umiaks for hunting seals and whales to insulated clothing and semi-subterranean winter houses warmed by soapstone lamps. Their spiritual worldview was deeply pragmatic, focused on animistic rituals to appease the spirits of the animals they hunted. For the Norse, adopting Inuit subsistence strategies like seal hunting during winter or learning to build snow houses would have been more than a practical shift. It would have been a profound cultural and religious compromise. Historical evidence suggests contact between the groups was limited and often tense. The Norse seem to have largely maintained their pastoral economy even as their pastures failed and their livestock grew thin, clinging to the identity their architecture and faith represented. This failure to comprehensively reinvent, to adapt both their material survival strategies and the belief system that underpinned them, appears central to the colony's quiet end. By the mid-15th century, the Eastern Settlement was silent. The last written record is a wedding at Valsey Church in 1408. After that, only the stones remained. Their story is a poignant lesson in the limits of cultural transplantation. The catastrophe here was a slow, creeping change in the rules of the world. The Norse tried to preserve a system, while the Inuit, whose entire culture was a product of continual adaptation, thrived. The true reinvention required was not just a new way to build a house, but a new way to see their place in a world that had grown fundamentally colder. The silence left by a catastrophe is eventually filled with story. When the ground stops trembling and the floodwaters recede, the survivors are left with a burning question: why did this happen to us? The answer for ancient civilizations was often woven into the very fabric of their identity, encoded into the foundational myths and legends that would guide their descendants for generations. These were not mere entertainment, they were sacred survival manuals written in the language of symbol and deity. Take the world's oldest great work of literature, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. Deep within its verses lies a detailed account of a great flood, a deluge so devastating that the gods themselves regretted unleashing it. The hero Utnapishtim is warned to build a great boat, to take aboard the seed of all living things and to ride out the storm. The parallels to later flood narratives are striking, but for the people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this was likely a direct echo of lived trauma. That region is prone to catastrophic, unpredictable flooding, where rivers could burst their banks with terrifying force. The myth served a profound dual purpose. First, it explained the unexplainable, attributing the disaster to divine displeasure with human noise and overpopulation. Second, and more crucially, it prescribed a solution, a model for survival. Piety, obedience to the gods, and heeding prophetic warnings became the prescribed path to safety. This story, repeated for centuries, reinforced a cultural memory that directly influenced behavior and architecture. It taught that to live in this landscape was to live at the mercy of higher powers, and that survival depended on maintaining their favor through ritual and respect. We see a similar encoding in a different kind of myth found across the globe, the world parent story. In traditions from the Maori of New Zealand to the ancient Greeks, there exists a tale of primal unity, where the earth and sky are locked in a close embrace, and the world as we know it begins only when they are violently forced apart. Scholars suggest these powerful narratives may be distant, cultural memories of immense geological upheaval, of a time when the very structure of the world seemed to be tearing itself apart. These myths explained the inherent volatility of the environment, why the ground could shake and the mountains could smoke. They framed the natural world not as a stable given, but as the outcome of a primordial conflict, a state of dynamic tension that required constant management. This understanding directly translated into practical strategy. If the world was born from chaos and required divine effort to maintain order, then human society's primary duty was to participate in that maintenance. This is where architecture and belief fuse completely. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were not just temples, they were stairways to heaven, artificial mountains built on high ground to facilitate communication with the gods who controlled the waters. By building them, humans were actively upholding cosmic order, reinforcing the separation between realms to prevent a return to chaos. Every ritual performed atop those structures was, in a very real sense, a maintenance procedure for reality itself, a direct survival strategy enacted in stone and ceremony. These myths were the blueprints for a volatile world, teaching each new generation not just what happened, but more importantly, what must be done to prevent it from happening again. A story told around a fire can outlast the strongest stone. When the immediate survivors of a disaster are gone, their most vital legacy is not a ruined city, but a warning, passed down through generations in the form of memory and myth. This is how the ghost of a past catastrophe actively guides the hands of future builders and priests, creating a powerful, inherited form of resilience long before any written code. The mechanism is cultural transmission, a living library of survival strategies encoded not in books, but in folklore, ritual, and sacred geography. Take the practical wisdom of tsunami stones. In parts of Japan, you can find ancient stone markers erected high on hillsides, often inscribed with simple, dire warnings. Do not build your homes below this point. Remember the Great Wave. These are not monuments to the past, they are active, physical regulations. They represent a collective memory of a devastating tsunami, crystallized into a permanent rule for town planning. A community that heeds this ancestral voice, placing its village above the line, is directly shaped by a disaster its members may have never personally witnessed. The story enforces the building code. Similarly, folklore across the Pacific is rich with tales of the wave that eats villages or spirits of the deep who demand respect. These are not just entertaining legends, they are behavioral guidebooks. A culture that tells vivid stories about a vengeful ocean spirit is far more likely to teach its children to read the sea's retreat as a sign to run for high ground. The catastrophe becomes a character in the moral universe, its lesson embedded in the very identity of the people. This principle extends deep into the foundations of architecture itself. Why does a community perform a specific, seemingly obscure ritual before laying the cornerstone of a new temple? Often, the origin is lost to time, but the action persists. Scholars suggest many of these foundational ceremonies can be traced back to a forgotten disaster, an attempt to appease the forces believed to have caused it, or to symbolically fortify the new structure against a repeat. The ritual becomes a technology of memory, a repeated action that unconsciously reinstates a protective measure. Conversely, the avoidance of certain places speaks volumes. A plot of land deemed cursed or unlucky, often on a fertile floodplain or an unstable hillside, might be shunned for centuries. This taboo is not primitive superstition, it is a highly effective form of land use planning. The folk memory, perhaps of a landslide that buried a village or a river that swallowed homes, manifests as a cultural aversion, preventing rebuilding in a geographically vulnerable location. The memory of the event fades, but the life-saving rule remains. This is how oral history builds a different kind of architecture, one made of story and custom. It allows a society to accumulate wisdom across centuries, turning the raw trauma of a single generation into a protective inheritance for all that follow. A past disaster becomes a silent partner in every planning decision, a whisper in the wind that says, "Build here, not there, honor the river, fear the shaking earth." It is the ultimate fusion of belief and practical survival, proving that sometimes the most durable material for rebuilding a civilization is not stone or timber, but a carefully remembered tale. A plague can reshape a civilization as completely as any earthquake. In the year 165 of the Common Era, at the very height of Roman power, a catastrophe of a different kind arrived, not from the earth or sky, but with the returning legions from the eastern frontier. The Antonine Plague, believed by historians to have been smallpox, swept through the interconnected arteries of the Roman Empire. It was a demographic disaster on an almost unimaginable scale, claiming millions of lives across multiple waves over 15 years. The impact was not just a number, it was a body blow to the empire's vital systems. The army, the engine of Roman security and expansion, was decimated. Farms and workshops lost the labor that sustained them, and trade networks faltered as ports and roads became vectors of fear. This was a slow, societal unraveling, a test of resilience against an invisible enemy. The Roman response to this biological catastrophe triggered a profound, multi-layered reinvention. With a severe shortage of free labor and a collapsing tax base, the economic foundations began to crack. The state responded by binding people to their professions and their land, a move that accelerated the transition away from the old slave-based economy toward a system where peasants traded their labor to local landowners for protection. This was the early, painful stirring of what would become feudalism, a new architectural blueprint for society itself, born from necessity and scarcity. You can see this shift mirrored in the physical landscape. The grand era of expansive, confident public works, the aqueducts, baths, and amphitheaters that declared Roman civic pride, began to wane. The immense resources and communal will required for such projects evaporated. Instead, architecture turned inward and defensive. Existing cities often contracted, building or reinforcing their walls for the first time in centuries, not against barbarian armies yet, but against a pervasive sense of instability. Building became more pragmatic, often on a smaller, more fortified scale, reflecting a world that had suddenly grown more dangerous and less certain. Yet the deepest reinvention was spiritual. The traditional Roman state religion, a contractual relationship with the gods to ensure the security and prosperity of the state, appeared to have catastrophically failed. Where were Jupiter and Apollo when the empire was brought to its knees by illness? This crisis of faith created a vacuum, and into that void flowed new beliefs. Mystery cults promising personal salvation gained followers, but none would prove as transformative as Christianity. Here was a belief system uniquely suited to the moment. It offered not a contract for public good, but a promise of eternal life and a compassionate God who understood human suffering. Its theology provided a framework to make sense of widespread loss, not as random misfortune, but as part of a divine narrative. Critically, it built resilient, supportive communities that cared for the sick and the poor, creating a tangible social safety net when the imperial one was fraying. The plague did not create Christianity, but it prepared the ground for its growth by shattering confidence in the old order. Within a century and a half, this once persecuted faith would be adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire, a monumental shift in Western civilization, directly catalyzed by a society's desperate search for meaning in the shadow of a devastating plague. The empire's reinvention was ultimately more spiritual than structural, proving that the most resilient architecture is sometimes built not of stone, but of belief. The stones of a temple are its bones, but the design is its memory. When a civilization translates the trauma of disaster into sacred space, the result is more than a building. It is a dialogue with danger, frozen in form. This is engineering faith, where every arch, every orientation, and every material choice becomes a coded lesson from a catastrophic past. Look at the shimmering simplicity of Japan's Ai's Grand Shrine, the most sacred site in Shinto. Its key architectural secret is not how it stands, but how often it is remade. For over 1,300 years, the shrine has been ritually dismantled and rebuilt on an adjacent plot every 20 years. While deeply spiritual, symbolizing death and renewal, scholars see a profoundly pragmatic root. In a land of typhoons, earthquakes, and relentless humidity, this practice ensures that wooden structures never decay to the point of catastrophic failure. More brilliantly, it forces each generation to relearn the exacting carpentry techniques, the precise joinery that allows the buildings to sway and survive seismic events. The sacred blueprint is not just preserved on paper, it is physically transmitted through the hands of the builders, allowing for subtle refinements with each iteration. The disaster preparedness is woven into the very rhythm of worship. This principle of defensive design echoes in the bell towers of medieval European churches in Italy and the Balkans. In regions stalked by earthquakes, architects learned a brutal lesson. A tall, heavy tower collapsing could destroy the entire congregation below. Their solution was structural separation. They began constructing the bell tower as a freestanding campanile, detached from the main body of the church. If the earth shook and the tower fell, it would crash away from the nave, sparing the lives of those inside. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a direct architectural response to repeated tragedy, a life-saving calculation made in stone. The dialogue extends to the very placement and foundation of sacred sites. Across the ancient world, temples were often erected on high ground, not just to be closer to the heavens, but to be safer from floods. Their foundations were dug deep into bedrock where possible, a literal search for stability in an unstable world. The choice of materials tells a similar story: the lightweight wood and thatch of structures in hurricane zones, the flexible timber frames in earthquake lands, the thick, insulating walls in regions of climatic extremes. Each decision is a hard-won verdict from nature's court. So when you stand before an ancient mosque, cathedral, or temple, you are not just looking at a monument to belief. You are reading a historical document on resilience. The soaring vaults and separate towers are a physical prayer for protection, yes, but they are also a testament, a community's way of whispering to the future. We remember the storm, we felt the quake, and this is how we chose to build a shelter for our souls against it. Water was the true sovereign of Inca. The Khmer Empire's breathtaking capital was not just a city of temples, but a colossal machine for managing the monsoon. Its lifeblood was an engineered landscape of vast reservoirs called barrays, intricate canals, and moats, all designed to capture the relentless rainy season downpours and store them to irrigate rice paddies through the dry months. This hydraulic mastery allowed Inca to support a population of perhaps 1 million people, making it one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth. The Temple Mountains, like the iconic Angkor Wat, were the spiritual pinnacle of this system, representing Mount Meru, the axis of the Hindu cosmos, but they were also its ultimate beneficiaries, sustained by the agricultural wealth the water network produced. For centuries, this symbiotic relationship between ritual and hydrology seemed unbreakable. Then, the climate began to shift. Recent studies of tree rings and sediment cores tell a story of profound instability during the 14th and 15th centuries. The region was struck by wild swings between extreme weather events, periods of intense monsoon rainfall that likely caused catastrophic flooding, followed by severe, prolonged droughts. This 1-2 punch was devastating for Inca's precise water architecture. Torrential rains would have overwhelmed canals, eroded earthen dikes, and filled the massive reservoirs with choking silt. Subsequent droughts would then leave the crippled system unable to provide. The very engineering that had enabled Inca's greatness became its vulnerability when the climate patterns it was built for ceased to exist. This environmental stress coincided with growing geopolitical pressures from neighboring kingdoms, straining the empire's resources. The result was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a deliberate, strategic reinvention. The political and economic center of gravity gradually shifted southward, closer to the Mekong River and the emerging maritime trade routes of the period. In the old capital, the monumental, state-driven temple construction slowed and then stopped. This architectural shift mirrored a profound spiritual transformation. The imperial cult, which had deified kings as incarnations of Hindu gods like Vishnu and Shiva to legitimize their control over land and water, began to lose its central authority. In its place, Theravada Buddhism gained widespread adherence among the population. This was a belief system with a different focus, one that emphasized personal spiritual progress and merit-making through individual acts of generosity, rather than the colossal, state-sponsored projects meant to affirm a god-king's power. The new faith did not require enormous temple mountains to function. It thrived in smaller, community-supported monasteries. This religious transition represents a societal pivot, a move away from the centralized, resource-intensive model that had become ecologically untenable toward a more decentralized, inwardly resilient way of life. Inca was not abandoned, it was transformed, its story teaching us that reinvention can be a gradual change of heart and priority, as impactful as any sudden flight to the cliffs. This psychological space between collapse and rebuilding is where the future is forged. After the dust settles and the immediate shock fades, a society enters a profound and volatile state that anthropologists call liminality. It is a threshold, a cultural no man's land where the old rules, the old hierarchies, and the old certainties have been swept away, but nothing new has yet taken their place. This collective trauma, while deeply painful, creates a unique and fertile emptiness. In normal times, innovators and radical thinkers might be ignored or suppressed by established powers. But in the liminal space after a disaster, everyone is listening. The old king or priest who failed to prevent the catastrophe has lost their authority. The traditional way of building homes has proven fatally flawed. Suddenly, the engineer with a new idea for interlocking stones, or the mystic with a new vision of the gods, finds a desperate and receptive audience. The community is united by urgent, existential questions. Why did this happen to us? How do we make sure it never happens again? And who or what can truly protect us now? The race is on to provide answers, and those answers materialize directly as new architectural forms and new theological stories. This is not a calm, planned evolution. It is a creative explosion born of necessity. Consider the parallel responses in two different worlds. After the Thera eruption shattered Minoan Crete, the old maritime palace culture lost its legitimacy. In that vacuum, the Mycenaeans on the mainland rose, adopting Minoan artistry but fusing it with a new, fortress-based architecture and a more martial pantheon of gods. They provided answers to those core questions, answers built in stone on defensible hilltops. Similarly, after the slow disaster of the Indus Valley's disappearing rivers, the old urban model became impossible. The collective experience of that loss likely pushed spiritual thought toward concepts of cosmic cycles and impermanence, ideas that would later blossom in Vedic philosophy, while architecture shifted to flexible, mobile materials. The key to a successful reinvention lies in this collective processing. The trauma cannot be buried or forgotten. Instead, it must be woven into the very fabric of the society's new story. The most resilient cultures are those that do not see themselves as passive victims of the disaster, but as active survivors who overcame it. They transform the catastrophic event from a shameful failure into a foundational myth, a story of trial and triumph that defines their identity. The flood becomes a test from which their ancestor was saved to repopulate the earth. The earthquake becomes the reason their ancestors learned to build dancing walls. By integrating the disaster into their cultural narrative, they accomplish something remarkable. They master the memory of the event. It no longer controls them with fear. Instead, it guides them with hard-earned wisdom. The community moves from a state of shocked reaction to one of purposeful innovation, turning the raw trauma of what was lost into the blueprint for what will be built next. This psychological journey from collective rupture to collective renewal is the silent engine behind every great reinvention in history. The great earthen pyramids of Cahokia once cast long shadows over a continent. On the fertile floodplain near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, a cultural powerhouse arose around the year 1050 of the Common Era. At its peak, it was a bustling metropolis, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, home to tens of thousands of people. Its skyline was not built of stone, but of earth, dominated by the colossal Monk's Mound, a terraced platform larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was the apex of the Mississippian world, a society organized around a powerful chiefdom, with a complex cosmology tied to the sun, agriculture, and the life-giving river. Their architecture was a direct expression of this centralized power, requiring the coordinated labor of thousands to move millions of baskets of earth, shaping the very landscape to reflect a sacred and social order. Then the landscape fought back. Starting in the 13th century, the environmental foundations of this grand experiment began to crumble. Tree ring and sediment studies reveal a period of climatic instability, marked by major flood events along the Mississippi River. These were not ordinary overflows, but catastrophic inundations that would have submerged the low-lying agricultural fields, and possibly even the residential districts of the great city. Imagine the fertile soil, carefully nurtured for generations, suddenly buried under layers of sterile sand and silt, or washed away entirely. This recurring aquatic catastrophe was compounded by another slow-moving crisis, the likely depletion of local resources. A city of that immense size would have placed enormous pressure on the surrounding forests for building material and fuel, and on the local game populations. The combination created a perfect storm of environmental stress. The social contract in a chiefdom is often based on the leader's ability to provide stability and abundance. When the floods ruined harvests and the forests grew thin, that authority would have been severely undermined. Famine and hardship likely exacerbated social tensions, turning the once unifying ceremonial center into a focal point for discontent. The grand mounds, symbols of collective purpose, may have become reminders of a broken promise. The reinvention that followed was not about building new monuments, but about abandoning the old model entirely. The response was a strategic, sweeping decentralization. People began to vote with their feet, moving away from the grand ceremonial center. They dispersed into smaller, more scattered communities along tributary rivers and into different ecological niches. This geographical shift led directly to a profound cultural transformation. The enormous, labor-intensive architectural tradition of mound building, which required the centralized authority to command such effort, went into steep decline. Without the great population center, the powerful chiefdom society it represented could not be sustained. The catastrophe effectively reversed a centuries-long trend toward centralization. In its place, a new, more resilient pattern emerged. Beliefs and social organization became more localized and clan-based. The grand solar cosmology that justified the supreme chief likely fragmented into more family-oriented traditions. The people of the Mississippian world did not vanish. They adapted by scattering their cultural seeds to the wind, allowing new, smaller, and more flexible societies to take root elsewhere. Their story teaches a powerful lesson about the fragility of hyper-centralization. When a civilization becomes too dependent on a single, vulnerable location and a rigid social pyramid, an environmental shock can topple the entire structure. The most resilient answer is sometimes to dissolve the center, to trade monumental unity for dispersed survival, allowing the culture to live on in 100 smaller, quieter, but more adaptable forms. The mound builder's dispersal is a lesson in geographical resilience, but some catastrophes are not a single wave or quake. They are the very air you breathe and the sun that beats down upon you. Climate change across the grand sweep of history has often been this kind of slow catastrophe, a persistent pressure that demands not a single reinvention, but a continuous, evolving dialogue between a people and their environment. This creates architectures not of sudden defense, but of deep, ingrained adaptation, where the very shape of a home becomes a sacred text written in clay, ice, and wind. These vernacular designs, passed down and refined over countless generations, represent a different kind of wisdom, one accumulated not from a single traumatic rupture, but from the patient, daily negotiation with an extreme world. In the searing deserts of Persia, the challenge was a relentless, desiccating heat. The brilliant answer was not just thick walls, but a clever manipulation of air itself. The Badger or Windcatcher Tower is a masterpiece of passive cooling. This tall, chimney-like structure rises above a building, its openings carefully oriented to capture even the faintest prevailing breeze. The captured wind is funneled down into the living quarters below, often passing over a pool of water or through underground canals to be cooled further before circulating through the home. Meanwhile, the hot air inside naturally rises and escapes through the tower, creating a constant, gentle circulation. This is not an appliance, it is the house itself breathing, a built form that turns the climate's challenge into its own solution. Similarly, in the arid American Southwest, the thick adobe walls of Pueblo architecture are a direct response to thermal extremes. Made from sun-dried earth and straw, these massive walls possess incredible thermal mass. They absorb the intense heat of the day slowly, preventing the interior from becoming an oven. Then, during the cool desert night, they gradually release that stored warmth, maintaining a stable, livable temperature inside. The architecture itself acts as a thermal battery, smoothing out the violent swings between day and night. At the opposite extreme, consider the igloo of the Inuit in the Arctic. Here, the genius is in the material and the form. Compacted snow, when carved into blocks and stacked in a rising spiral, creates a dome that is remarkably strong and insulating. The semi-spherical shape presents minimal surface area to the wind, and the snow itself traps tiny pockets of air, creating a barrier that can maintain an interior temperature dozens of degrees warmer than the outside air, all heated by nothing more than a small oil lamp and body heat. This is architecture created from the very substance of the challenge, a shelter conjured from the frozen landscape itself. What is profound about these examples is how this practical wisdom often becomes sanctified, woven into the cultural and spiritual fabric. The orientation of a badger, the recipe for the perfect adobe mix, the precise angle for cutting a snow block, these are not just building techniques, they are cultural inheritances, often surrounded by ritual, story, and taboo. The efficient house becomes the ideal home, and the knowledge to build it is a sacred trust passed from elder to child. This fusion shows us that reinvention can be a slow, accretive process, 1,000 tiny innovations over centuries, each one tested by time and climate, until the solution is so perfect it becomes inseparable from the culture's identity and beliefs. It is a quiet, enduring testament to human ingenuity, proving that some of our greatest architectural triumphs are not declarations of dominance over nature, but elegant, learned dances with its most persistent rhythms. A perfect wall in an earthquake zone does not stand rigid, it learns to move. Yet in the same volatile world, another civilization chose a different kind of answer, one of overwhelming mass and immovable presence. As the influence of the maritime Minoans waned, a new power consolidated on the rugged Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. They inherited a landscape even more violently alive, a tectonic crossroads where the Earth's restlessness was a constant fact of life. Their architectural reinvention was not about flexibility, but about an assertion of sheer, defiant permanence in the face of that power. They built fortresses that looked less constructed and more like outcroppings of the mountains themselves. At sites like Mycenae and Terens, they erected what later Greeks would call Cyclopean walls. These were barriers built from colossal, irregular limestone boulders, some weighing many tons, fitted together with minimal shaping. The name itself, from the mythical one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, speaks to the awe they inspired. People of a later age could not conceive of humans moving such stones, so they attributed the work to monsters. But the truth is more fascinating. This was a deliberate, brilliant response to seismic threat. While the Incas would later design walls to dance, the Mycenaean approach was to build a wall so profoundly heavy, so deeply interlocked and wedged into the bedrock, that it would simply absorb the energy and refuse to fall. The irregular shapes of the stones were key, creating a jigsaw puzzle of immense weight that could shift and settle without losing cohesion. It was architecture as geological anchor. These citadels, perched on high, defensible hills, served a dual purpose. They provided genuine physical security from both earthly tremors and human enemies, but they also projected an unmistakable symbol of a new social order. The age of the peaceful, sea-trading Minoan palace was over. This was the age of the warrior king, and his power was literally set in stone. The massive walls declared that here was a leader who could command the labor to reshape the very landscape, offering protection in return for loyalty. This shift in stone was mirrored in the realm of belief. The Mycenaean pantheon, known from clay tablets written in an early Greek script, already featured gods whose names we recognize: Zeus, Hera, and crucially, Poseidon. In these early times, Poseidon was not merely a god of the sea. He was fundamentally the earth shaker, a deity whose domain included the terrifying power of earthquakes. His presence at the heart of their worship reveals a world where divine force was inseparable from terrestrial instability. The gods themselves could make the ground heave, so it was only logical that the king, who claimed a special relationship with those gods, should build fortresses that could withstand their anger. The Cyclopean Wall was thus both a practical engineering solution and a theological statement, a declaration that human authority could create a space of order within a cosmos ruled by unpredictable, earth-shaking divinities. Their reinvention shows us that there is more than one path to resilience. Sometimes, the answer to a shaking world is not to bend, but to build a throne upon the very stones that tremble. A catastrophe's shockwave travels far beyond the epicenter. When the earth trembles or a volcano erupts, it does more than level cities. It shatters the intricate, invisible webs of trade that connect distant cultures. These networks, carrying not just goods but the vital flow of information and innovation, are severed in an instant. Yet in the resulting chaos, a paradoxical process begins. The very disaster that destroys these channels can become a powerful new vector for cultural exchange, a brutal but effective agent of diffusion that scatters seeds of knowledge across the landscape. Skilled artisans, displaced priests, and fleeing survivors become unwilling ambassadors, carrying the blueprints of their old world into new ones. The ash cloud from Thera did not just bury Minoan ports, it likely sent a wave of refugees across the eastern Mediterranean. Among them would have been master builders, painters, and engineers whose sophisticated knowledge was now a portable commodity. Where they settled, they brought with them the advanced construction techniques of Crete, the secrets of working with ashlar stone, the designs for light wells and vibrant frescoes. This diaspora of expertise meant that a technological solution forged in one place, perhaps in response to seismic activity, could suddenly take root in another, adapted to local materials and new threats. We see this clearly in the archaeological record. The Mycenaeans, rising in the wake of Minoan decline, did not simply conquer or ignore their more advanced neighbors. They absorbed and transformed their legacy. The graceful Minoan column, with its distinctive downward tapering shape, appears in Mycenaean palaces, but the context shifts. It is integrated into the fortified, heavy architecture of the mainland citadels, a graceful element now framed by Cyclopean might. This is not mere copying, it is creative synthesis, a hybrid form born from the collision of a collapsing culture and an ascending one. The catastrophe acted as a catalyst, forcing a transfer of cultural DNA. The same principle applies to beliefs. When a central power like the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia fractured under the pressures of drought and social unrest, its collapse did not erase its cultural influence. Instead, it diffused it. The symbols, myths, and architectural styles associated with Sargon and his successors spread outward, carried by displaced elites and adopted by smaller city-states eager to claim a share of that lost legitimacy. The most enduring example is the flood myth, a story of divine retribution and survival, born from the very real, traumatic experience of the Tigris and Euphrates bursting their banks, became a cultural touchstone. This narrative was so powerful, so explanatory of the world's precariousness, that it was adopted and adapted by successive Mesopotamian cultures, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians, each adding their own gods and local details. The story traveled because the fear it addressed was universal, and the catastrophe that inspired it created the conditions for stories to migrate alongside survivors. This process turns disaster into an unintended engine of innovation. A building technique perfected for earthquake resistance in one land might inspire a new form of fortress wall elsewhere. A ritual developed to appease a river god might merge with the worship of a mountain spirit in a neighboring valley. The exchange is rarely peaceful or voluntary, but it is profoundly creative. It forces technologies and beliefs to travel, to be stripped down, and to be reassembled in novel ways to meet new challenges. The hybrid forms that result, like the Mycenaean column or the many versions of the Great Flood, are testaments to a hard truth. Sometimes the most important thing a collapsing civilization builds is not a final monument, but a message in a bottle cast into the turbulent seas of history, waiting to be found and reinterpreted by those who come after. The trembling earth finally found its chronicler. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, the city of Lisbon, one of Europe's wealthiest capitals, was celebrating All Saints' Day. Churches were filled with worshippers when the first tremor struck. Within minutes, a massive earthquake, now estimated to be between 8.5 and 9.0 in magnitude, reduced much of the city to rubble. The shaking was followed by a devastating tsunami that surged up the Tagus River, and then by raging fires that burned for days. The scale of the loss was staggering, with tens of thousands of lives lost and the heart of a global empire erased. But unlike the ancient catastrophes we have explored, this disaster struck in the full light of the Enlightenment, an age that prized reason, observation, and scientific progress. Lisbon's ruins became a laboratory, forcing a reinvention that was as much about the human mind as it was about mortar and stone. The immediate architectural response was led by the Marquis of Pombal, the king's chief minister. He famously declared, "We must now bury the dead and care for the living." His rebuilding plan was revolutionary. He ordered systematic surveys of the damage, asking citizens to describe the effects of the quake, creating one of the first scientific datasets of a seismic event. From this data came the world's first comprehensive, state-enforced seismic building codes. The new downtown of Lisbon, known as the Pombaline style, was an engineering marvel. Buildings were constructed with a flexible wooden skeleton called the gaiola, or cage, inside the masonry walls. This internal framework was designed to sway with tremors, preventing total collapse. Streets were widened into a rational grid to prevent fire from jumping and to allow for clear evacuation routes. This was not just rebuilding, it was the birth of modern urban planning for disaster resilience, an architectural philosophy born directly from empirical observation. Yet the earthquake's tremors reached far deeper, shaking the very foundations of European thought. In an age where philosophers like Leibniz argued we lived in the best of all possible worlds, orchestrated by a benevolent God, the indiscriminate destruction of Lisbon presented an unbearable contradiction. How could a just and omnipotent deity allow such suffering, especially on a holy day in a devoutly Catholic city? This crisis of faith ignited a continent-wide philosophical debate. Voltaire, in his famous satirical poem on the disaster, mocked the optimistic philosophers. He asked pointedly, if this is the best of all possible worlds, what then are the others? His later novel, Candide, relentlessly satirized the idea of a perfectly ordered universe, following his hero through a series of senseless tragedies. The earthquake forced thinkers to confront natural phenomena not as divine punishment or inscrutable mystery, but as subjects for rational, scientific inquiry. It helped catalyze a shift toward secular explanations, paving the way for the formal science of seismology. The reinvention here was dual: a tangible new architecture of flexible cages and wide streets, and an intangible new architecture of thought, where humanity began to systematically study the Earth's violence, not just fear it. The street map you follow today might be a direct message from the past. Urban planning, the grand design of a city, is rarely a blank canvas. More often, it is a living document, a palimpsest where the faint, erased lines of old catastrophes still guide the hand of the modern planner. The very grid of a street, the mandated material of a wall, the open space of a plaza, these are frequently not aesthetic choices, but inherited rules written in the language of fire, quake, and flood. This is architecture at the scale of the community, a collective memory made concrete and asphalt. Ancient Rome, for all its engineering marvels, was a tinderbox of narrow alleys and wooden tenements. After a devastating fire in the year 64 of the Common Era, which raged for days, Emperor Nero introduced new building regulations. While the historical details are complex, a clear lesson emerged from the ashes. Subsequent Roman urban planning in many cities began to emphasize wider streets, which served as fire breaks, and greater use of brick and stone for party walls. The disaster created a template for safer urban form, a lesson in using space itself as a defense. This pattern repeats through history with striking clarity. The Great Fire of London in 1666 consumed over 13,000 homes. In its wake, the Rebuilding of London Act was passed. It was a landmark piece of urban legislation that outlawed wooden facades and mandated brick or stone construction for all permanent buildings. It also standardized street widths to prevent flames from jumping and created clearer access for firefighting. The city that rose from the ashes was fundamentally different in its very fabric, not by accident but by law. The catastrophe was fossilized into the building code, ensuring that the memory of the fire would shape London's skyline for centuries. In our modern era, this dialogue between disaster and design has become a precise science. After the 1964 Niigata earthquake in Japan, vast areas of the city sank and tilted as the solid ground turned to a liquid slurry, a process called soil liquefaction. The event was a brutal lesson in geology. In response, Japanese urban planners, and later those in seismic zones like San Francisco, developed sophisticated liquefaction hazard maps. These maps directly inform zoning laws, restricting the construction of heavy buildings, hospitals, or schools on the most vulnerable soils, while designating those areas for parks, parking lots, or other low-risk uses. The open space you see in a modern city might not be for recreation alone. It is a calculated void, a place where the city has chosen not to fight the Earth's instability, but to respectfully step aside. Every time a building code requires a certain type of foundation, or a fire ordinance mandates a second staircase, or a zoning law preserves a waterfront as a buffer zone, you are witnessing the long shadow of a past catastrophe. The urban landscape becomes a museum of resilience, its layout a continuous, unspoken conversation between the present and a traumatic past, ensuring that the city itself remembers what its inhabitants must never forget. The river's color comes from the very soil it carries, a thick, life-giving silt that has nourished Chinese civilization for millennia. Yet this same gift has a terrifying duality, for the Yellow River is also known as China's sorrow. Its bed, constantly raised by the accumulation of silt, has historically flowed high above the surrounding plains, held in check only by human-made dikes. When those dikes failed, which they did with tragic regularity, the river would burst its banks and carve an entirely new course to the sea, unleashing floods of biblical scale across the densely populated farmland. The loss of life from a single course change could reach into the millions, and the destruction of harvests could doom entire regions to famine. This was not merely a natural disaster, it was a cosmological and political event of the highest order. In the Chinese worldview, a ruler governed with the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule contingent on maintaining harmony and prosperity for the people. A catastrophe of this magnitude was interpreted as the clearest possible sign that the dynasty had lost that mandate. The heavens themselves were withdrawing their favor, and the river's fury was the physical manifestation of that withdrawal. This created an unbreakable link between hydrological engineering and imperial legitimacy. The architectural response to this perpetual threat was not a single temple or wall, but a project of staggering, landscape-scale ambition. the continuous construction and maintenance of a vast, state-controlled dike system. This was architecture as a verb, a never-ending campaign of dredging, reinforcing, and heightening earthworks that stretched for thousands of miles. It demanded a colossal, centralized bureaucracy capable of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of laborers and managing immense resources. The imperial state, in many ways, was forged by the river it sought to control. Its very structure evolved to meet this singular, survival-level task. The Ministry of Works became one of the most critical arms of the government, and a successful official was often one who could manage water. When the system was maintained effectively, the dynasty could claim it was upholding cosmic order and the people enjoyed stability. But when corruption, neglect, or a simple lack of resources led to a catastrophic breach, the consequences were total. The ensuing flood and famine would shatter the social contract. Desperate, displaced peasants, seeing the failure of the state's primary duty, would often rise in revolt. The fallen dynasty was seen as having been justly abandoned by heaven, and the rebel leader who could eventually restore order and recommit to taming the river would found a new dynasty, claiming the freshly bestowed mandate of heaven. Thus, the cycle would begin anew, with a reinvestment in the dikes as the first and most sacred duty of the new regime. Each dynastic collapse and renewal was, in essence, a forced reinvention of governance and a re-engineering of the landscape, all driven by the relentless, silt-laden flow of a single, unforgiving river. The landscape itself became a chronicle of this struggle, an earthen archive of triumph, failure, and the perpetual human endeavor to negotiate with a force of nature that was both the source of life and an instrument of divine judgment. A serpent coils around the base of a stone column, its scales carved with meticulous care. This is not merely decoration, it is a captured fear, transformed into a guardian. In the wake of catastrophe, when communities raise new structures from the rubble, every choice is saturated with meaning. The architecture becomes a physical language, a way to speak to the gods, to history, and to future generations about what was lost and what must now be defended. This is the profound symbolism in stone, where belief becomes material, and a building becomes a three-dimensional prayer for protection. Consider the symbolic motif of the serpent or the dragon, which appears across continents in post-disaster art and architecture. In many ancient worldviews, the serpent was intimately linked to the chthonic forces, the powers of the underworld and the deep earth. It represented the raw, chaotic energy that could cause the ground to split and mountains to spew fire. After experiencing such violence, a culture does not simply erase the symbol of that power. Instead, they seek to master it. By carving the serpent onto the lintel of a temple or weaving it into the design of a city gate, they are performing a symbolic act of capture. They are taking the very emblem of the chaos that destroyed them and putting it to work as a guardian. It is a declaration that the destructive force has been recognized, appeased, and now enlisted in the defense of the new order. The chaos is not gone, but it has been ritualistically tamed and redirected. This symbolic reinvention extends to the very substance of the buildings. The choice of stone was rarely arbitrary. Specific types of stone were often believed to possess inherent protective or sacred qualities. A community might travel great distances to quarry a particular granite or marble, not just for its durability, but for its perceived spiritual resilience. Using that stone was akin to building a wall with blessed blocks, each one carrying a piece of the sacred landscape into the heart of the city. It was a way to literally fortify their new world with the strength of the earth's most stable bones. Similarly, the orientation of a temple or a city's main axis often held deep cosmological significance. Aligning a structure directly with a distant, immutable mountain peak or with the rising sun on a specific holy day was an act of connection. The mountain, standing firm through countless ages and tremors, represented eternal stability. By tying their most sacred building to that mountain, architects were creating a symbolic anchor, tethering their fragile human order to the most permanent feature they could perceive in a volatile world. Even the selection of a building site itself was a symbolic act. A location might be chosen because it was where a miraculous survival occurred, or where a divine sign was seen after the disaster. Building there consecrated the ground, transforming a place of trauma into a place of sacred memory and renewed covenant. Every step taken across that plaza, every ceremony performed in that hall, would unconsciously reinforce the narrative of survival and divine favor. The architecture itself tells the story. The thick walls speak of a desire for safety, the high ground speaks of a fear of floods, and the repetitive, harmonious patterns in the carvings speak of a longing for cosmic order. Together, they form a complex material theology. This is not architecture as mere shelter, it is architecture as a continuous ritual. The community, through the act of building and then inhabiting these symbolic forms, participates in an ongoing ceremony to maintain the balance of the world. They are building a permanent argument against chaos, a silent, stone sermon that whispers to every generation, "We remember the darkness, and this is the light we built to keep it at bay." The wind carried not just dust but the topsoil of an entire continent. During the 1930s, the American Great Plains endured an ecological catastrophe so severe it seemed biblical in scale. This was the Dust Bowl, a disaster born from a collision of natural drought and human ambition. For decades, settlers had plowed under the deep-rooted native prairie grass, the very anchor of the plains, to plant wheat. When a severe, multi-year drought struck that exposed soil had nothing to hold it, it turned to powder, and the relentless prairie winds lifted it into towering, suffocating clouds that blotted out the sun, buried farms, and carried the soil as far east as the decks of ships in the Atlantic. This was not a sudden geological event, but a slow, self-inflicted unraveling of the land itself. It forced a painful, nationwide reinvention of both the physical landscape and the national psyche. The architectural response was immediate and practical, focused on the home. Traditional farmhouses, with their loose-fitting windows and porous walls, were useless against the fine, invasive grit. In response, people adapted with a kind of desperate ingenuity. They stuffed rags into every crack, sealed windows with tape and wet sheets, and hung damp cloths over doorways. This vernacular architecture of survival was about creating an airtight seal against the outside world. More formally, new home designs and government pamphlets began to emphasize dust-proofing features, tighter construction, and the use of materials that could be easily cleaned. The very idea of shelter transformed from a refuge from weather to a fortress against the earth itself. But the true reinvention had to happen outside, in the fields. The old belief in the inexhaustible land, the core of the manifest destiny narrative, lay shattered under dunes of Oklahoma topsoil in Washington, D.C. The catastrophe demanded a new relationship with the ground. The federal government, through agencies like the Soil Conservation Service, became an active partner in reshaping the agricultural landscape. Farmers were taught and subsidized to adopt radical new techniques, contour plowing that followed the natural shape of the land to prevent water runoff, terracing, and strip cropping. Most visibly, they planted millions of trees in long, linear shelter belts. These rows of trees acted as windbreaks, slowing the fierce winds at ground level and physically holding the soil with their roots. This was architecture at a geographical scale, a conscious redesign of the visible horizon for the sole purpose of stability. Culturally, the trauma of the Dust Bowl, immortalized in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath and the photographs of Dorothea Lange, dealt a permanent blow to the myth of rugged individualism. It demonstrated that some challenges were too vast for any single family or farm to overcome. The crisis catalyzed a profound shift toward a new belief in collective, federal responsibility for environmental stewardship and social welfare. The disaster seeded a modern environmental consciousness, the understanding that the land was not a commodity to be used until depletion, but a fragile system requiring careful scientific management. The American dream was rewritten, no longer just about claiming limitless frontier, but about the hard, cooperative work of sustaining a vulnerable home. A society's greatest strength can become its fatal flaw. The story of reinvention is not one of universal triumph, but also of profound caution. For every civilization that learned to build dancing walls or worship new gods, there are those that could not bend, and in their rigidity they broke. The conditions for failure are a mirror image of success, a catastrophic event meeting a culture so deeply invested in its own identity that it cannot conceive of another way. The Norse in Greenland clung to their longhouses and their European Christianity even as the ice closed in, a poignant example of cultural transplantation meeting its environmental limit. But this tragic dynamic finds perhaps its most isolated and stark example on a remote island in the vast Pacific. Rapa Nui, known to the world as Easter Island, stands as a monument to the limits of reinvention. For centuries, a complex Polynesian society flourished there, achieving a feat of engineering and social organization that still inspires awe: the carving, transporting, and erecting of nearly 900 massive stone statues, the moai. These figures, with their solemn, elongated faces, were not mere art. They were the physical anchors of a belief system, representing deified ancestors who watched over clan territories and ensured prosperity. The act of creating and raising them was a sacred competition, a way for rival chieftains to demonstrate their mana or spiritual power and their command over resources and labor. The entire social and spiritual order was built around this monumental endeavor. Yet the island itself was a fragile world. It was geographically isolated, a speck of land thousands of miles from any other shore, with limited natural resources. The catastrophe that unfolded was not a sudden volcanic blast or a single great flood, but a slow, grinding process of ecological degradation. To move the colossal moai, which could weigh up to 80 tons, across the island's rolling hills, the Rapa Nui people relied on a system of wooden sledges and rollers. This required vast quantities of timber from the island's once dense palm forests. Generation after generation, trees were felled for statue transport, for canoe building, and for fuel. Compounding this, evidence suggests a shifting climate may have brought drier conditions, stressing regrowth. The deforestation was a creeping disaster. Without trees, the soil eroded, washing precious nutrients into the sea. Bird populations which nested in the forests collapsed. The ability to build fishing canoes vanished, cutting off a major protein source. The very activity that defined their civilization was systematically destroying the ecosystem that sustained it. Here we see the critical failure to adapt. Their belief system and social structure were so intensely focused on the competitive erection of moai that it likely blinded them to the mounting crisis, or made addressing it culturally unthinkable. To stop building statues would have been to abandon the core ritual that maintained social order and divine favor. It would have required a complete spiritual reinvention, a new way to relate to the ancestors and to each other that did not consume the forest. That reinvention did not come in time. As resources became desperately scarce, the society tipped into a downward spiral of conflict and hardship. The archaeological record shows a violent shift, with spear points becoming commonplace. The monumental phase ended with many moai toppled, perhaps in inter-clan warfare. The old gods represented by the statues had clearly failed. In the aftermath, a new cult did arise, the Birdman ceremony, which focused on a different kind of competition to obtain the first egg of a migratory bird. This was a reinvention, but it emerged from a shattered society with a fraction of its former population. The lesson of Rapa Nui is sobering. It shows that the very cultural elements that enable a civilization's greatest achievements, its unifying beliefs and its most spectacular architecture, can become traps. When the environment changes, whether by human hand or climatic shift, a society must be able to question its own foundations. The Norse and the Rapa Nui both faced slow-motion calamities, and in both cases, their deep attachment to a specific identity, expressed in stone and timber and ritual, prevented the timely, radical shift needed for survival. Their stories remind us that reinvention is not a guarantee, but a desperate, creative choice that some cultures, for all their ingenuity, are ultimately unable to make. From the ashes of fallen cities and the silt of vanished rivers, a clear pattern emerges. The civilizations that not only survived but transformed their trauma into legacy all shared a common blueprint for resilience, a dual reinvention that reshaped both their physical world and their story of it. The first pillar is technological pragmatism, the unflinching willingness to discard a failing model. This is the Minoan palace abandoned for the Mycenaean fortress, the Indus Valley's baked brick grid traded for mobile wooden settlements, the Inca learning to let their walls dance. It is architecture as a direct answer to a specific, violent question posed by the planet. Yet, stone and mortar alone are not enough. The second, equally vital pillar is narrative flexibility. This is the spiritual and social story that makes sense of the new reality. When the old gods of the harvest or the sea seemed to fail, new understandings arose, whether it was Poseidon the earth shaker demanding fortified citadels, or a compassionate Christian God offering solace amidst plague. The community had to rewrite its own origin story, weaving the catastrophe into its foundational myth as a trial overcome, a lesson learned. This narrative shift provided the social cohesion and shared purpose needed to undertake the immense labor of physical rebuilding. The most successful adaptations reveal a fascinating strategic shift, a move away from brittle centralization toward resilient decentralization. The great, vulnerable capitals like Anka or Cahokia, dependent on a single, fragile resource system, often fractured under pressure. Their reinvention was not to build a bigger temple mountain, but to dissolve the center entirely. The population dispersed, carrying their culture into smaller, more adaptable communities, as seen in the post-classic Maya migration or the Mississippian scattering. This geographical shift forced a parallel change in social and spiritual life, from grand state rituals to more localized, clan-based practices. Similarly, there is a recurring move from a posture of domination over the environment to one of intelligent integration. The Norse in Greenland tried to impose a European pastoral system on an Arctic landscape and failed. In contrast, the Inuit, the ancestral pueblones in their cliff dwellings, and the builders of Persian windcatcher towers all achieved resilience by deeply studying and collaborating with their specific environment. Their architecture became an extension of the local climate, not a declaration of war against it. Ultimately, these threads weave together a profound insight. Human history is a global, millennia-long laboratory of disaster response. Each civilization, from the Yellow River Valley to the Andean highlands, was an experiment in how to build a society on an unstable planet. The experiments that endured longest were those that mastered a delicate balance. They learned to hold their core identity lightly enough to let go of practices that threatened survival, yet firmly enough to maintain cultural continuity. They could mourn the loss of a grand temple while celebrating the ingenuity of a new, safer home. This comparative view reframes our entire journey. We are not the descendants of those who merely endured catastrophes, but of those who used them as catalysts. The most enduring legacy a civilization can leave is not a static monument, but a living example of how to listen to the earth, to bend without breaking, and to continually rewrite a story of belonging in a world that is beautiful, bountiful, and fundamentally untamed. Our journey through the ruins and rebirths of history reveals a powerful, recurring truth. Humanity's greatest leaps often follow its hardest falls. We have walked with survivors in the choking ash of Thera and stood beside engineers on the trembling ground of Peru. We have listened to the stories told in the silent grids of the Indus Valley and the echoing kivas of the Southwest. In every instance, the pattern holds. Catastrophe does not merely destroy, it creates a terrible and fertile emptiness. It clears the ground both literally and spiritually for something new to be imagined. The fear of the shaking earth gave us walls that dance. The memory of the vanishing river seeded philosophies of cosmic cycles. The trauma of the pandemic reshaped an empire's soul. These are not accidents of history, they are its deliberate creative pulse. The architectures we still admire, the temples, citadels, and cliff dwellings, are not just shelters. They are conversations. They are humanity's side of a dialogue with a planet that is alive, dynamic, and sometimes violently expressive. They are physical prayers for stability, blueprints of hope carved in stone, wood, and earth. And the beliefs that sustained these societies were the other half of that conversation. The stories that made the chaos meaningful and gave people the courage to rebuild. This dialogue between human ingenuity and planetary force is the hidden engine of our collective story. It teaches us that resilience is not a passive quality of endurance, but an active, creative art. It is the art of listening to what the world is telling us through its tremors and its droughts, and then responding not with despair, but with invention. Today, we face a different kind of planetary conversation, one of rising seas, shifting climates, and global interconnection. The scale is unprecedented, yet the essential challenge is ancient. How do we build a society that can withstand the pressures of a changing world? How do we find stories that unite us in care for our common home? The civilizations we have explored offer no simple manual, but they provide something more valuable. A masterclass in adaptive thinking. They show us that the key is not to build higher walls against the sea, but to learn to live with its rhythm. It is not to dominate the landscape, but to integrate with its logic. Our modern reinventions are already taking shape in the form of green architecture that mimics nature's efficiency, in urban planning that makes room for floods, and in a growing global consciousness of stewardship. The stories from our past remind us that this work is not a departure from who we are, but a continuation of our deepest tradition. We are the children of those who watched their world change and chose to remake it with wiser hands and more humble hearts. Let these tales of transformation inspire you. When you look at the challenges of our time, see them not as endings, but as the very material from which a better future must be built. Our shared task is to listen, to learn, and to begin our own chapter in this eternal, creative dialogue with the world we call home.